It was August doth when I first saw it. The sun was already climbing high over the South Texas coast, painting the Starbase facility in that harsh white light that makes you squint even through sunglasses. I had been watching this place for years now. You start to recognize the rhythms of it, the slow crawl of transporters across the gravel, the bright flash of welding sparks from open bay doors. The way workers move with purpose, but never hurry. Starbase has its own clock, and that clock does not care about yours. But that morning, something was different. A massive object was being moved from mid-bay to the outside yard. I saw it through the heat shimmer rising off the concrete, and at first my brain refused to make sense of what I was looking at. It was a Starship nose cone. That much was obvious. The smooth conical shape. The polished stainless steel skin catching the morning sun. I had seen dozens of these nose conies come and go over the years. But this one was different. There was a door cut into its side, a real door, larger than a grown man. And it was not the kind of clean engineering panel you might expect. The opening was draped with what looked like black nylon fabric, hanging loose, lacking any solid structure behind it. It moved slightly in the breeze, almost like a curtain. I leaned forward in my seat. My coffee had gone cold an hour ago. I did not care. This door, I realized, was meant to be used. Often, the fabric covering told me that. A permanent door for a one-time test would be heavy, reinforced, expensive. This was something different. This was something workers would walk through again and again. Whatever was inside this nose cone, SpaceX engineers wanted regular access. That alone was strange enough. But then the transporter turned. As the nose cone rotated on its cradle, I caught sight of something on the underside. A panel, bristling with valves and electrical connections. The kind of interface you only see on hardware meant to plug into life support systems, fluid lines, power couplings, sensor leads. My mind started racing through possibilities, and then I saw it. A sticker, bold, unmistakable, HLS, 3 letters. Human landing system. My hands actually shook a little. I had been waiting for this. We had all been waiting for this. The human landing system version of Starship is the vehicle that will, if everything goes according to plan, carry the first astronauts back to the surface of the moon since 1972. More than 50 years of silence on that gray, dusty world, and then suddenly, boots again. American boots. And this strange skull-like nose cone, with its fabric door and its life support couplings, was a part of that future. But why this nose cone? Why now? And why did it look so strange? I started digging. The story behind this particular nose cone, it turns out, is older than it appears. This is not a new piece of hardware built fresh for a new mission. This is a survivor. A relic that has been quietly waiting for its real purpose. Originally, this nose cone was built for Ship 21. Anyone who has followed the Starship program knows that Ship 21 was one of the early prototypes, a vehicle that was meant to fly tests in the early days of the program. But things changed quickly at Starbase. They always do. Plans shift, designs evolve, hardware gets reassigned. Ship 21 was set aside and the nose cone was eventually reassigned to Ship 22. Ship 22 had its own troubled story. By the time it was meant to fly, the design had moved on. The engineering had advanced. Ship 22 became obsolete before it ever left the ground. It was dismantled, cut apart, recycled. Most of its components were scrapped or repurposed for newer builds, but not the nose cone. The nose cone was different. The nose cone was special. Someone, somewhere in the SpaceX engineering ranks, looked at that nose cone and saw something the rest of us would not see for almost 2 more years. They saw the future. They saw the moon. They saved it. The nose cone was brought back to mid-bay. And inside mid-bay, away from public view, away from the cameras and the cars and the watchers like me parked along the side of the road with our cold coffee and our telephoto lenses, the engineers got to work. They gooded it. They tore out everything inside, every bracket, every wire, every internal structure that had been built for Ship 22's purposes, and then they began rebuilding it. Differently, from scratch, they installed a new floor, a hexagonal one, perfectly symmetrical, 6 sides, clean geometry, But here is where it gets strange. The floor was not a sealed surface like the floors of the other Starship nose cones I had seen. Most nose cones have a closed floor panel, a solid plate that separates the nose cone interior from whatever sits below it. This new floor had a hole in the middle, a big one, open, yawning, and the edge of the floor panel was cut entirely around the outer ring, fitted precisely to the curve of the cone's interior wall. The nose cone now had a way to access whatever was below it, or for whatever was below it to access the nose cone. There was more. The engineers integrated an electronic arch into the structure. They mounted it onto a single ring. This shortened the overall length of the nose cone compared to the other ones still sitting in mid-bay. And critically, it meant this nose cone had no payload bay, no room for cargo, no space for satellites or experiments or scientific instruments. This nose cone was not built to carry things, it was built to carry people. The next part of the story is what really got my attention. When SpaceX finished the modifications, you might have expected the nose cone to be moved to the launch site. That is where most flight hardware goes eventually. Or maybe to Massey's, the test facility where they run pressure tests and structural tests, and all the brutal abuse that flight hardware has to endure before it ever sees a launch pad. But this nose cone did not go to either place. It went to the payload processing facility instead, a detour, an unexpected one. And there, on a freshly poured patch of concrete still pale and clean from the recent pour, it was set down, gently, carefully, like an artifact being placed in a museum, and then the workers came with paint. I watched it happen, white paint, roller after roller of pure, clean white paint going up over the polished steel. Slowly, methodically. The way a painter at a famous gallery might restore an old masterpiece. They were not in a hurry, they were taking their time, they wanted this to be right. Now, you might think the paint was just for looks. Maybe SpaceX wanted the nose cone to resemble the rendered images of the lunar HLS Starship that NASA has been showing in its presentations for years, and that is part of it. There is something to be said for hardware that looks like the hardware you promised. Public perception matters. Astronaut training matters, investor confidence matters, but the real reason was simpler and colder, literally. Most rockets and spacecraft are painted either white or in darker colors, and there are good engineering reasons for both. White is favored when you want to keep a vehicle cool. White reflects sunlight. Dark colors absorb it. In the brutal Texas sun, a steel rocket sitting outside can become almost too hot to touch within an hour of dawn. That heat is not just uncomfortable, it is dangerous. Heat does bad things to rockets. It causes fuel to evaporate. Liquid oxygen and methane are stored at incredibly low temperatures. They want to be cold. They want to stay liquid. Any heat that creeps in through the outer skin of the rocket pushes that fuel toward vapor. Vapor means lost propellant. Lost propellant means lost performance. Lost performance means a mission that might not reach the moon. Or worse, a mission that runs out of fuel at the worst possible moment. Heat also makes things expand. Steel expands, aluminum expands. Composites expand, different materials expand at different rates, and that creates stresses. Stresses create cracks. Cracks kill astronauts, so you paint the rocket white. Anything that can keep the rocket cooler without adding weight is a free win. White paint adds almost nothing to the mass of the vehicle, but it can drop the surface temperature by 20 or 30 degrees on a hot day. That is a tremendous benefit for the cost of a few buckets of paint. For this particular nose cone, though, the cooling was even more important than usual. This nose cone was going to sit outside for a long time out in the open, through Texas summers, through Texas thunderstorms, through the brutal coastal sun that bleaches signs and cracks plastic and warps metal. And inside this nose cone, engineers were going to run tests. Important tests. Tests that depended on stable temperatures and consistent conditions. If the nose cone absorbed too much heat from the sun, those tests would be ruined. The interior temperature would swing wildly. Sensors would give bad readings. Equipment would behave unpredictably. The data would be worthless. So the white paint was not vanity. It was science. It was making sure that whatever happened inside this nose cone would happen in a controlled, predictable, repeatable way. And what was going to happen inside that nose cone? The most important test of all. Life support. Think about what it means to send humans to the moon, not just to orbit, not just to fly past, to land, to live there even briefly, to breathe, to eat, to sleep, to use the bathroom, to survive in an environment that wants to kill you in approximately a dozen different ways every second of every day. The moon has no air, none. The surface is in a near-perfect vacuum. Step outside without a suit, and your blood will boil, not from heat, from the lack of pressure. Your lungs will rupture trying to push out air that your body cannot hold in. Your eyeballs will swell. Your hearing will go first, then your vision, then everything else. The moon has no protection from radiation. The sun fires charged particles at the surface constantly. On Earth, we are protected by an atmosphere and a magnetic field. The moon has neither. Astronauts walking on the lunar surface are exposed to radiation levels hundreds of times higher than what we experience on Earth. The moon has temperature extremes that would shock anyone who has not studied them. In direct sunlight, the surface can reach 250 degrees Fahrenheit. In shadow, it can plunge to -250 degrees. A single rock can have one side hot enough to boil water and the other side cold enough to liquefy oxygen. To bring humans through this, the lunar Starship cannot just be a rocket, it must be a life raft. A sealed environment, a perfect bubble of Earth in the middle of nothing. The life support system is what makes that bubble possible. It is what generates the oxygen the astronauts breathe. It is what scrubs the carbon dioxide they exhale. It is what controls the temperature and humidity and pressure inside the cabin. It is what filters their water and recycles their waste and keeps the air clean. And it must work, every second, for weeks at a time, without failure, without compromise. The astronauts on board will have nowhere to go and no one to help them if something breaks. This is why the nose cone was sitting on its patch of fresh concrete in the payload processing facility, gleaming with new white paint. This was the lab. This was where engineers would push the life support system through every imaginable scenario. Power failures, sudden pressure drops, carbon dioxide spikes, coolant leaks, air filter clogs. Every nightmare an astronaut might face, simulated and tested and solved here on the ground before a single human ever set foot inside the rail thing. This was the room where mistakes were allowed. Once those astronauts left Earth, mistakes would not be allowed anymore. There is something poetic about it when you think about that way. A nose cone built for one mission, abandoned, saved, transformed, painted white, and given a new purpose as the testing ground for keeping humans alive in space. Hardware has lives, in a sense. Stories, journeys. This is not even the first HLS prototype that has been built at Starbase. Back in 2021, SpaceX built an earlier version, a white nose cone similar in some ways to this new one. But that earlier prototype seems to have been destroyed at some point. Probably it served its purpose, taught the engineers what they needed to learn, and was retired. Hardware moves fast at Starbase. Yesterday's prototype is today's scrap. Then last year, a NASA document appeared, a set of presentation slides. Among the images was something remarkable. Photos of an HLS elevator prototype, an airlock prototype, and one image labeled Crew Cabin VR Evaluation. Virtual reality, astronauts wearing headsets, walking through a digital version of the Starship cabin, learning the layout, training their minds and bodies for an experience they could not yet have for real. That virtual cabin will eventually become a physical cabin. And that physical cabin will eventually become the place where two astronauts ride down to the surface of the moon for the first time in over half a century. The schedule is ambitious. NASA wants an uncrewed lunar demonstration mission to launch in 2024, ahead of the crewed Artemis 3 mission planned for 2025. Each of these missions will require not just the lunar Starship itself, but also multiple tanker launches. The lunar Starship cannot reach the moon on a single tank of fuel. It will need to be refilled in orbit. Tanker after tanker will launch, dock with the lunar ship, transfer propellant, and depart. Only after enough fuel has been gathered will the lunar Starship light its engines and head out to the moon. How many tankers will it take? Even the engineers are not entirely sure yet. The exact number depends on 100 variables that are still being worked out. The HLS program faces challenges that go beyond engineering. There is the question of timing. Multiple agencies and vendors must align their schedules. Spacesuits must be ready. Ground systems must be ready. The SLS rocket that will carry the astronauts to lunar orbit must be ready. Orion, the crew capsule, must be ready. And of course, the lunar Starship itself must be ready. Elon Musk has insisted that HLS Starship will not be the pacing item. He believes other elements of the program will be the bottleneck. NASA officials have been more cautious. They remember Apollo. They remember missions where the lunar lander was not ready and the program had to fly without it. They remember the lessons of that era. Amit Kshatriya, who serves as Deputy Associate Administrator for the Moon to Mars program at NASA headquarters, has spoken about this directly. He has explained that NASA is looking at every option. They have asked all their contractors to bring their production schedules in as much as possible. They want to fly the mission the way it was designed. But they also know from history that the most important thing is to keep flying, to not let the whole program freeze if one element falls behind. NASA's strategy, in his words, is to encourage everyone to aggregate as much hardware as they can. Build it, prepare it, get it ready, and then, depending on where everyone is in production, the right missions can be selected based on what is actually available. This is what Apollo did when the lunar lander was not ready. They flew other missions. They kept the program moving. They kept astronauts in space and engineers in their workshops, and the public focused on the goal. From a production standpoint, NASA considers it critical to communicate this clearly to every vendor, including SpaceX. The message is simple. Build everything you can. Get it ready. Be prepared to fly. We will figure out the order later, but the worst thing we can do is sit still. And so the white-nosed coney sits in the Texas sun. Workers move in and out through the fabric-covered door, carrying tools and test equipment. Sensors record data, engineers gather around screens, watching readouts. The life support system breathes its first slow breaths, learning to keep imaginary astronauts alive. Someday, those tests will become real. Someday, this Nosacone will have done its job, and a new Nosacone built on everything learned it here will carry actual human beings down to the surface of the moon. They will step out onto gray dust. They will plant their boots in soil that has not felt a human footprint in over 50 years. They will look up at Earth hanging in the black sky, and they will know that everything they need to survive is held inside a steel cone that started its life as spare parts for an obsolete rocket. There is a kind of beauty in that. The hardware does not know its own story. The nose cone does not know that it was almost scrapped, that it was saved, that it was rebuilt, that it was painted white in the Texas heat. It does not know what is waiting for it, but the engineers know, and the watchers know, and someday the whole world will know. Until then, the skull at Starbase keeps its secrets, behind its fabric door, beneath its white paint, inside its silent steel walls, waiting for the moon.